Welcome to our colloquium today. In all sorts of ways, actually, our speaker today will give us lots of food for thought for thinking about land and acknowledgements and dispossessions. And that's really the spirit of this in a very meaningful way. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce everybody to Dr. Samina Raja, who's here, who is our speaker today. Samina is a SUNY Distinguished Professor, which is an enormous honor across the whole of the state. She is the founder and director of the Food Systems Planning and Healthy Communities Lab at the University of Buffalo, so shorthand known as the Food Lab. This is really a cutting-edge leading lab in this area nationally and even globally. Her research, her education, her civic leadership, she has an astonishingly thick CV, which I have with me if anybody's interested afterwards. But this combination of research, education, and civic leadership has shaped her work. And she's really focusing on these questions in conditions of contested governance. So that is the space in which she's thinking about these questions in Buffalo, in the US. She has a very huge research project in the US called Growing Food Connections. And that's really thinking about how do we connect between small and mid-sized farms and food insecure people through community food-centered systems for planning. She is a prolific scholar. She has published hundreds of academic articles, official plans, policy reports, community-led and engaged sorts of materials. And she's recently co-edited a book called Planning for Urban Agriculture, a new ethic for city building that came out last year. That's available open access, so definitely take a look. She works in Buffalo and across the US, but she also works in the global South and has a project called Planning for Regenerative Urban Agriculture in Globalizing Urban Environments. And that's really thinking about how do we support indigenous food infrastructure systems in sensitive context appropriate ways. And that work is in Kashmir, in Indian-occupied Kashmir and elsewhere in India. So she's going to give us a mix of this work that spans between the global north and global south, and it's really a great pleasure to hand you the mic. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
All right, that's not how we do it in Buffalo. I say good afternoon, you say something back. Okay. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It is a delight, and I'm checking that you all can hear me and folks on Zoom can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. Is that microphone to be your star now?
That's why I have to look in that direction. Can you hear me now? Perfect. It's more than pretty. It represents my homeland, and it is my armor to move about in the world. But thank you. It is pretty. So maybe I'll begin there and say that I am an indigenous Kashmiri. You might have heard of the fabric cashmere, which that is, but that actually is a colonized version of the word Kashir. So I am Kashmiri. Agar kan Kashir ver bozan shuvin kenas to sarni mion salam. It's possible folks from Kashmir are dialed in, so I'm just wishing them a greeting of peace and to you all as well. So before I begin, I want to offer gratitude to all the organizers that made my visit possible to all of you. I spent quite a bit of time wandering Cornell's campus as a Cornell parent many years ago. So I know this campus from a parent's perspective. And it is truly a delight to come back and visit colleagues who I've had the pleasure of knowing and getting to read the work of new colleagues and just finding a lot of intersections. So thank you. Also, thank you to the staff that does all the legwork in the background, and I apologize for being that tardy guest. So thank you all. For the students in the room, I'm your lunchtime entertainment. I appreciate the Halloween costumes, and I look forward to your questions. The conversation today is very much about the land that I stand on, and I appreciated the land acknowledgement. And it's more than that. It is about who gets to decide how we relate with land, not own land, but how we relate with land. As an indigenous Kashmiri, we rarely say that land belongs to us. We say we are of this land, signaling a challenge to the way in which planning as a profession and other professions, design professions, think about land. So I'll touch on that today. But most of my talk today is really reflecting work in the United States. If people are curious about work in Global South cities, because certainly contestation around land is not just a US condition. In fact, US has trained the rest of the world on how to create some land contestations. So we can extend the conversation to other places as well. So the title of my talk draws from the book that was just mentioned that came out last year. And my game plan is really to focus on telling a story. I think I will grab your attention more if I do that. But before I do that, I might be the teller of the story, but these stories are really about a bunch of people and partners and communities and places who make this work possible. And if I were to name all of them, we would be here for a couple of days. So instead, I have listed them in categories, beginning first from the community partners that inform this work. This includes urban growers who have the kind of relationship with land that challenges the theoretical frameworks that planners use. The way in which my urban farmer colleague, Alison Dehoney, talks about land is not the way planners and city planners talk about it. This work, like pretty much life itself, is a collective enterprise with the UB Food Systems Planning and Healthy Communities Lab, many of whom might be dialed in. Several people's work is reflected in this presentation, but especially Kate Hayes, who is making sure my slides looked spiffy to the architects. Work is not possible without people who invest resources into good work. I joke that our lab is the slowest lab in the world because we work very slowly. So we gotta have patient funders who are okay with slow work. Think slow food, slow research, slow food lab. It doesn't mean that we are lazy. It just means we try to make sure that we don't leave places worse than we found them. And then specifically one project called Growing Food Policy from the Ground Up that I will be drawing from over the course of our conversation. And that is a multi-institutional two-city project. I'll be taking snippets from it and you'll hear references to it. I might say the phrase GFPGU, which stands for Growing Food Policy from the Ground Up. So apologies for all the abbreviation. I'll try to be as clear as possible. Last but not the least, one of the ways in which I learn a lot is from my students. So Growing Towards Equity graduate practicum in 2023 is a radical group of graduate students that held my feet to the fire and produced this report that I will be referencing today. Several of those students are practicing planners now. In fact, Kate Hayes, who worked on this presentation with me, is a graduate of that practicum. Okay, so in the conversation that we have, I will do the following. You'll hear me set the stage a little bit so that you get a sense of my values and approach, which is not just a fluffy conversation about values, but to illustrate that science and research is different and better, I would argue, depending on making your epistemological stand clear. So that's what I will begin with. Then I'll tell you a little bit about the motivation for the book on which my talk is based. Then dive into that one story of Buffalo, New York. How many of you in the room physically are from Buffalo? Raise your hand. Amazing. At least one person? Okay, great. And then towards the conclusion, I'll talk about this idea of public nurturance and offer some cautionary notes for aspiring, inspiring planners and architect types, and then we'll have a conversation. Before I dive in, I like to give the story away. So I'm gonna begin by telling you that public nurturance is this idea that planners' job is to think about how to engage in public nurturance. It is about caregiving in a community. It is explicitly about publics, not a single public. And it is explicitly about focusing on those who are pushed to the margins of those publics. And there's a series of ideas that I will present at the end that I think are important for us to consider if we are to work in public nurturance. And I am focusing on public nurturance because I think sometimes researchers and scholars, myself included, tend to be heavily focused on critique. And I notice that my students and colleagues are left with a sense of hopelessness. And as an indigenous Kashmiri who has seen her people disappear, I just refuse to give in to that. So for me, public nurturance is actually resistance, not abandonment and not giving up. So look forward to you all tweaking the idea of public nurturance. And I will say in preparation for this talk, in the book, there are 4 elements around public nurturance. But in preparing today, a 5th one popped into my head. So you are going to hear about public nurturance 2.0. Okay, so going into the values and approach. The picture that you are seeing on the slide is on my right is Dr. Carol Ramos-Herena, who was then a PhD student, and she is standing at Juneteenth Agricultural Pavilion in Buffalo, New York. Buffalo has the 2nd largest Juneteenth festival in the United States. You should come. And Juneteenth Agricultural Pavilion is a space created by Jamie Swigert for Black and brown folks to gather and advocate for liberation through food. And think about those examples. And our lab does public workshops there, and we are the research partner for Juneteenth Agricultural Pavilion. So just explaining the picture. We focus on people-led planning, but really in 3 elements. The fuchsia one is research. So there are some examples of the kinds of research we do. Then the orange in the middle is educational projects. And then the last is middle is yellowish. The last is orange, which is around policy. So all of these 3 things dovetail as we move research forward. And cutting across all of these is growing food policy from the ground up that I mentioned to you. The work that we do, or the way it is done, is really through co-production. And what does that mean for students? I'm sure you all have read about it. It means that people work together to come up with ideas of how to move forward. So you can see in this one picture, which is, by the way, a community reading club that my lab used to host, where faculty, students, community partners read the same book. This one, I believe, we were reading Black Food Geographies by Ashante Reese, and devise ideas together and move forward together. An important principle for us is creativity, joy, and action. As an example, if our lab publishes an article, they'll do community workshops. I've also had an indigenous Kashmiri poet read a Japa article and write a poem based on that. I'll tell you, more people listened to his poem than read my Japa article. So there are different examples of how we do that. That's probably why we're a slow lab. After you produce an article, translating it into action and ideas and laws takes a long time. And then sometimes we have to be epistemologically open and politically engaged. In a few years ago on May 14, 2022, a white supremacist walked into a grocery store on the east side of Buffalo and shot dead 10 people. And he was able to pull this off because there was only a grocery store in that neighborhood. Very quickly, my lab was asked to provide briefings to policymakers, explain why this happened, et cetera, et cetera. I could not just say, sorry, I'm a researcher. I'm not going to talk to the White House staff. It was a different White House. But we also had to engage in silence until our community partners gave us direction on how to talk, how to work. So all of those principles require us to think different about what methods we use and how we engage politically. And then we have to stick with the partners even after we have worked with them. So as an example, the person in the green box is Allison Dehoney, the farmer that I continue to work with, and you will hear her story today. The book, the motivation for the book, now gone over the values and approach. The book is a tribute to Jerry Kaufman. Some of you, especially in the faculty and people online perhaps, are familiar with his work. Jerry Kaufman was my mentor and a faculty member at the UW Wisconsin-Madison, and quite a scholar practitioner. I'm sure you have read his work in planning, but I'll note a few things. Early in his career, he was very much focused on planning practice. He worked for the precursor of the American Planning Association. He was one of the people who drew ethics to the attention of planning practitioners. In fact, was instrumental in drafting the first AICP Code of Ethics. Much later in his life, he got interested in food. So good chunk of his life, he worked on ethics. And then later in his life, when I met him, he was working on food. What was curious is that he never explicitly wrote about the two things together. So a bunch of us, his students, his colleagues, his partners, came together, 50 plus people, tell me never to do that again, co-edited this volume that brings those twin threads together. So ethics and food very much are in this book, and they argue that you cannot talk about urban agriculture in cities without clearly addressing questions of ethics. So that's Jerry, and that portrait is by my beloved colleague, Dr. Elisa Ojei Diamond. This book is online. Please find it, read it, enjoy it, cite it. Okay, in the book, you will come across this one story, actually several stories from Buffalo. And I'm going to tell you this story now, doing a time check with Natasha. Okay, all right. That was very fast, because now I'm going to tell the real story. This one story spans, okay, to the first 30 minutes? Amazing. This story that I am telling you is over the course of my observations in Buffalo. So I moved to Buffalo, New York in 2001, and I have chosen to stay there. It's an incredible place to see the failures of planning, but also an incredible place to see the power of people-led planning. If you want that in a single space, you come to Buffalo, and you respect Buffalo. This story I will juxtapose against a longer planning history and told from the perspective of how one urban farmer experiences it. So you'll get both. You'll get the policy stuff and you'll get the story stuff. Obviously, to tell that story, there's a whole bunch of research papers, books, articles, regression models, ethnographic work, interviews that I will not go into details, but some of you will want to read them. So one book, one report, and 5 articles, find them, because I'm going to hide this. This is for the students. This work is based on longitudinal work, some spatial analysis, some quantitative work, some qualitative work, some artwork, and you have to figure out where to find it. All right. So I am going to instead take us to Buffalo's municipal food policy landscape. In the book, we're arguing for justice as a way to understand the role of urban agriculture in cities. If we do that, we cannot look at time at one moment in time without understanding the struggles of justice in a city and a place. So even though I arrived in Buffalo in 2001, people were working around food justice in the city long before I even decided to migrate to the United States. So I have some example in yellow boxes of Black-led action in the city of Buffalo. Some notable examples. In 1969, Build Academy, which was a school started by parents, offered free school meals. They were very connected to broader Black liberatory movements in the United States. Black Students Union at the University at Buffalo used to run a school breakfast program that was inspired by the Black Panther Party. So this was not new to the city of Buffalo. There was a Black-led food co-op in 1978. The dotted line has a different scale, in case the architects are wondering, and the solid line is a different scale. The Black-led food co-op was started by one of the people, is Miss Della Miller. She might well be online, I don't know. And she did this because she recognized that the east side of Buffalo, which you will hear more about, was constantly underserved. So the struggle for food is not a new one. So food might be hip, food might be discussed in farm-to-table things, but food is really about existential crises in Black communities, but also about joy. Quite a lot of liberatory work happens around kitchen tables, including in Buffalo. So all of that work had already been happening, but not recognized. But there is a chapter on this work in the book by Dominique Griffin, so I hope you read that. So I am moving forward to bring us to 2001 and onwards. And I chose that partly because Jerry Kaufman wrote a chapter with Kami Pothakuchi in JAPA called Food, a Stranger to Planning. And if you haven't read it, it's quite a classic piece, worth reading. It was a call to planners saying, y'all are working on housing, roads, whatever all people, transportation. But what about the one thing that people need? Food. And it kind of changed conversation in planning about why food matters. And it started a whole list of things, including training a big group of people around the country, including myself. I had the pleasure of training with Jerry and Kami. But in Buffalo, things were happening. Community organizations like the Massachusetts Avenue Project, which is on the west side, not the east side of Buffalo, started a farm and started training young people to work on the farm because they were getting picked up on the street by police, getting into challenging situations because they didn't have really resources. Massachusetts Avenue Project's kids, they still are running that program. At one time, the city of Buffalo's on-time high school graduation rate was about 50%. That means only 50% of kids graduated on time, but MAP's kids, 100% graduated on time. So you have to come to Buffalo to witness this yourself. So my lab has had the pleasure of working with MAP for more than 20 years, continuously. It's a long-standing action research project, and they're still doing remarkable work. But today's story is not about MAP. You can read about it in another paper called Rust Belt Radicalism. Today's story is about urban fruits and veggies, which was incorporated in 2014 against what I would call a food invisible landscape of municipal food policy in Buffalo. If you look at the city of Buffalo's timeline, which is below the horizontal line, everything above is what community action was. On the bottom, you'll see that as late as 2006, the city's comprehensive plan basically said nothing about food. Keep in mind that this is a city where there were high rates of food insecurity, etc. Nothing, no mention. And it wasn't until people from Massachusetts Avenue Project, folks from the east side, other food advocates rallied and said, we need to change things, that things started changing. And in fact, very proud, who would know that I would be proud as an academic of a chicken ordinance, but I am. Up until this ordinance was passed, you could not raise chickens in the city of Buffalo, which is actually an important food group for growing immigrant and refugee populations. So now you can have up to 4 chickens on a parcel, and we can discuss setbacks and all of that if you're interested. And then there was zoning code reform, and for the first time in the city's history of zoning, urban agriculture was a permitted use across all zoning categories. It's not perfect, and I'm sure people on Zoom are saying that, but it was an incremental win. And then a food policy council was established through advocacy of people on the top. So yes, this was established by law, but it really came because of all of this stuff happening on the bottom. So I can talk more about this, but I think one notable thing tied to public nurturance is what you're going to see on the screen now. Oops, sorry, let's go back. Byron Brown's regime started. Anybody have heard of Byron Brown? Just as well. Byron Brown was appointed the mayor of the city of Buffalo, voted in, not appointed, in 2006, around here. And I invited him to inaugurate this first Buffalo Food Policy Summit, and he did, to his credit. And then he stuck around for a long time. During this period, India Walton ran for the mayor. If you don't know India Walton, she would say that before people knew Zohran Mamdani, they would have heard about her because Zohran came and campaigned for her in Buffalo. You all know Zohran Mamdani? Okay, just making sure. India preceded him. She won the Buffalo primary, and Byron Brown was shocked, and other people were shocked, and the big developers rallied around and flipped the election in the actual election, and India did not win the election. So we are up for a new election, and we'll see who the next mayor is. But the point is, all of this community action, all planning action, actually unfolds in relationship to these governance regimes, like Byron Brown's regime. So planners who don't pay attention to that, they wrestle with providing public nurturance. So this will come back at the end. So now you are familiar with the landscape within which urban fruits and veggies gets incorporated, this urban farm that you are going to hear about. Are you with me? Okay. So urban fruits and veggies, this is the city of Buffalo, and in map form. And urban fruits and veggies looks like on this site, there are 3 sites. Urban fruits and veggies did not want 3 sites. Allison incorporated it in 2014, and something happened over Brown's administration that forced her to make some decisions that resulted in these 3 sites. More on that later. But on the left side, you kind of get a sense of where there is lack of investment. This follows redlining patterns, by the way. I'm just tired of showing redlining maps. We got to move on. And this disinvestment still exists. And on this portion, on the right side, are the number of supermarkets, major supermarkets on the east side of Buffalo. So everything in white is not within access of supermarkets, right? And this is where the massacre happened on 5/14. So urban fruits and veggies, market gardens, other community gardeners, other community partners are trying to change the landscape of Buffalo. They are building projects so people can grow their own food. They're creating social spaces. They're providing green infrastructure. They are providing environmental services on former brownfield sites. They're doing all of this in spite of, not because of, the municipal policy landscape that I showed you. And in this area, the effort is even more because these are the areas that have highest levels of food insecurity. To give you a very pointed example, before data was disappeared in the United States, kind of crazy that I have to say that at a public lecture, we used to track food insecurity. We're still, I think next month, it'll stop, unfortunately. But historically, in the United States, food insecurity rates hover around 11 to 13%. Keep that percentage in mind. In this neighborhood, our lab did a household survey, and the food insecurity rates were hovering around 40%. So this is not a small problem. This is, and huge problem that requires attention from municipal government. So that's the landscape. But land that is necessary for food systems, that is necessary for us to survive, has been treated in that municipal governance regime as commodity. So property values on the east side are going up, especially around where big institutions are located, like hospitals, medical campus, etc. And you have a good chunk of the land still controlled by city government that is vacant. So what is the city doing? The city, one might presume that they are thinking about land as a public infrastructure. I would argue, and the book talks about this, that they think about it as a commodity for speculation, not for what Alison Mahoney can do with it. And I will show you an example. So in Buffalo, if you are a farmer or you are a community gardener, you have to go through this maze that looks like a Pac-Man game. How many of you are young enough to know what that is? Oh, thank goodness. Okay. It gives me a headache to look at this diagram. If you are this, go there. If you're this, go there. And then, oh, by the way, at the end, you can access the land. So you can find this diagram in one of the publications I will share, but the point is you can access the land is only possible if you know how to decode municipal policy, municipal procedures, municipal regulations. The book argues that it is not the job of civil society to decode municipal regulations. It is the job of planners and planning types to create governance arrangements that are transparent. This is not, flowcharts are not transparency. You cannot expect farmers to know what is the process for filing 22 papers that would allow them to access land. This is no different than me expecting the mayor or the planning director to know what vegetable is in season. Okay. So urban fruits and veggies as a farm, Alison is a resident and committed to the east side of Buffalo, founded this operation about 10 years ago. It's the only Black-owned urban farm. And she had these sites already set up. She was not thinking of a not-for-profit. She was thinking about what can I do right from an entrepreneurial perspective. Thank you. First 30 over? Perfect. And what she does is she raises healthy food in one of those underserved areas. And she also partners with healthcare providers. When they issue prescriptions, she will provide Veggie RX. I think one of her faculty partners might be in the room. Is that welcome? So he can tell you all about it. So delighted to have you here. So Alison grows food, distributes food, encourages people how to cook it, but also trains others on how to do it. So clearly she's providing a public service on the east side of Buffalo. So she decides that she would acquire more property and she would expand her operation. Originally, she had these 2 sites. And what's fun is that some of them are city-owned, but there was a family friend who said, you are doing so much good, use my property to put up your hoop house, right? So that's a community. So she does this, and then she applies for access to new other lots. And the city government and Department of Planning asks her to acquire what is called developer status. So she had to go through the process of acquiring developer status the same way Simonelli Corporation or other development groups would acquire developer status. She paid for it. She did all of that. Architectural drawings, everything that developers have to do. And then what happens? Then she put in the bid, and the government stalls her bid for 2 years. And over those 2 years, what happens to land? For those of you who are not into growing, it takes about 2 years to prep land to get it ready. They didn't even give her access. And it stalled her from opening other operations. And finally, she gave up. She said, I'm not doing this anymore. And she acquired a third site that was not city controlled. It was privately owned. And that's where she is now building a holistic wellness center. So in a short amount of time, there was a lot of paperwork, a lot of meetings, including one that I attended, which was super curious. A lot of discussion between planning, development office, real estate, and Allison about how she needs to demonstrate what her project is. That entire experience, in my judgment, did not understand land as public infrastructure. So even on the prior map, it said city-owned land. I have to repeatedly correct that and say this is public-owned land. It is not city-owned land. City doesn't exist unless we think about it as being driven by the public. So back to the land access diagram. Somewhere on this is Allison. She's lost, like which way did she go? And I will say, to sum up that story, Allison's story, is that it's actually not possible to make nicer flowcharts, more clear one-stop shop and websites, more clear regulations, until you fundamentally reimagine forms of governance. No amount of speeding up things, making things easier is going to do that. It's not going to fix it. What you need is literally rethinking land not as commodity, but as something else. And that's what demands public nurturance as a framework for city planning, not being assistant to the next big development project that comes along. Okay, so that brings me closer towards the tail end of my comments, and I'm excited now we have time for conversation. Those new forms of governance, what might they look like? In the book, we explore some of those forms of governance. So to give you a little bit of connection between what will come out of my mouth and how you will follow up in the book is organized in the beginning with some of the theoretical underpinnings of my comments today. So you could go to the beginning of the book for that. Then in the middle of the book are examples of how city governments have tried to make urban agriculture more equitable. So you'll read examples from Colorado, New York City, other places that I'm forgetting, Madison, Wisconsin. And then towards the tail end, we explore in the book what does public nurturance looks like. Across all of that, new framing, new practices, and then new solutions, the underlying thread across all of that is justice. And it's not a scary word, even though that has happened in the United States. You could say fairness, you could say other ways, but justice is about, do we make sure that the relationships that produce an outcome are fair? Are the processes that produce an outcome, are they fair? Are the solutions that produce an outcome, are they fair? And then ultimately, are those outcomes fair? And in that underpinning that is behind public nurturance, I do want to call out what this is grounded in. Bless you. This is grounded in the work of scholars such as John Powell. So you could read Racing to Justice and you'll see threads of what inspires me. You can read the work of Black food scholars, Ashante Reese, Ashley Gripper, Monica White, and you will see that that inspires me. I used to say that you could read the capability framework of Sen. I've been struggling with it. We can talk about it later. But definitely there are threads of that there. And in some ways, It's also drawing from inspiration by other people that are really not planners. So one of them is actually a Kashmiri poet, which unfortunately you will have a hard time finding translations, named Sheikhul Alam, who describes different ways of relating with land, and some of this is drawn from that. So public nurturance requires rethinking relationship with land. Rethinking it not as commodity, but as public infrastructure that we belong to and we relate with. It means that some reductive approaches that are very popular in planning will necessarily fail. So as an example, I will use an example from a third of my brain called fiscal impact analysis. So some of you all might be training in fiscal impact analysis. Fiscal impact analysis trains planners to look at the revenues generated by land and look at the expenditures tied to land. And I skipped all of that method stuff today. But if we reduce land to one-time revenues and one-time expenditures, then what does it say about how we relate to the land over generations? Where is the space for climate crises in fiscal impact analysis? As New York City struggles with the possibility of inundation, who cares what the property tax rate is for commercial versus residential? I don't dismiss fiscal impact analysis. In fact, that was my dissertation, and I still think about it. But I think that focusing on a method or a practice without thinking about the overall theory and the governance conditions in which those methods are being applied are supremely dangerous. So enforcing a zoning code in the town of Amherst without thinking about the context is different than enforcing the same zoning code without thinking on the east side of Buffalo. So what I would argue for this last part of my talk is that anytime you are facing or considering a method, then your first job is to ask about the theoretical framing of that method. So fiscal impact analysis, for example, does not consider longitudinal impacts, does not consider externalities, does not consider interaction between land uses when those fiscal impacts are generated. My economist friends will argue we have gotten better at methods, but here I would draw inspiration from Jerry Kaufman and an economist who trained me, Jack Huddleston. Jerry was an ethicist and Jack was an economist, so this is what you get from that. Jerry would always ask, okay, you have a good method, but who is it serving? Fiscal impact analysis might be serving land as commodity, but what about the idea of food impact analysis? That is the basis of public nurturance. So to sum it up, public nurturance until yesterday had 4 elements. The fifth was really in all of those 4, but I decided this morning I really like the number 5 more than I like number 4. So the first thing is that it's a value-explicit process. One cannot claim to put together urban agriculture plans. Not all urban agriculture, by the way, is good. That's why I talk about this. In fact, the book opens with a critique of urban agriculture, because urban agriculture is a lever sometimes for gentrification, sometimes for exclusion. Community gardening was used as a method to discipline Black and brown bodies. So it's not without complications. That's why if you are interested in equitable urban agriculture, then you want to think about it as a value-explicit process, not that all urban agriculture is good. If that was the case, we wouldn't be here in this country not recognizing that entire agricultural system was built on stolen Black labor of enslaved Black people. That was also agriculture. So just want to make sure that we think about public nurturance as an explicit process that centers an ethics of care. And that means protecting the interests of the marginalized. There isn't any, like this, I don't even know what decade there was when we talked about unitary public interest. There isn't such a thing. And this is where John Powell's work is especially illustrative. It builds the capacity of marginalized people to help to decode those regulations, to not have Allison do the work of figuring out how to now become not only a farmer, but also a developer. It requires that those, whatever processes you put in place have accountability measures. There's a whole planning literature about how we don't implement plans, we don't measure progress. I honestly think that skirts an entire conversation around accountability. Why bother measuring implementation if you don't know who you're accountable to? And this really is a gift from Ms. Della Miller, who one year when we were working on a plan together based on the principles of Kwanzaa, she said, I want to add another principle, and it is around accountability. And then number 4, that sometimes even planners who are trained to think systems tend to focus on superficial level rather than structural factors. Public health, for example, thinks about structural determinants of health. Planners ought to think about structural determinants of outcomes in place, rather than simply thinking, can I work to create an incentive to bring a grocery store into the east side? Well, what are you doing about why there isn't a grocery store? If that grocery store is not going to be owned by Black business owners and is not going to do wealth generation in that neighborhood, you're only fixing the symptoms, which is why the framing around the absence of food retail in Black and brown neighborhoods should be around food apartheid, not a phrase that is very common in the planning literature, which I won't say because a linguist told me as soon as you say it, it gets cemented in people's heads. So you can guess what phrase I'm not saying. I'm just saying food apartheid. Then the 5th one really happened as I was thinking about all 4 of these, and it occurs to me, it was extremely challenging for Allison to get her farm expanded and do the work that she does within the context of planning under Byron Brown. And right now, we're seeing a debate unfold in New York City about whether public grocery stores should exist or not. You've been following all that, right? So what's happening there is not actually debates about policy or planning solutions. The debates are actually about forms of governance. And as those political debates about forms of governance unfold, planners can't just take a backseat and say, all forms of planning can function under all forms of governance. Planning too has to reimagine itself under different forms of governance. And for folks who don't know, public grocery stores are not a new thing. State of Kerala in India has 3 supermarket chains that sell food, electronic goods, they control prices. So, not that shocking. But what will planners do under a democratic socialist regime versus a democratic regime versus a Republican regime? These are not questions that we ought to avoid. These are questions that we just ought to discuss and think about what does planning look like under different governance regimes. To an extreme point, and I will say, what got me thinking about this is actually the region of Jammu and Kashmir, where there is complete misgovernance. What does planning look like in that setting, where you don't know whether a person will get lifted by the military overnight and not show up at home? What does a planner do? So limits of planning under different governance regimes, I think, is the exciting and maybe most important frontier for planning. And with that, am I on time? Yes. We will have conversation. You can cheer later.
Okay.
I do want to do some logistics, which is if you want to follow up by email, email this address, not me, because I'm a bottleneck. And that's our website. And to make it easy for the students, There's this thing called QR codes, apparently. You can thank Kate Hayes for this.
Feel free to use your device at this
Yes,
moment.
at this point, use your device. On the top is the book. In the middle is the studio practicum that was based on the book before the book was published. So my students actually tested out these ideas. And growing towards equity is the basis for policy proposals that are being discussed by the coalitions in Buffalo. And then the last one is a national database that curates local government food systems plans and policies. So you can download them, use them, read them, and also suggest things that are not in the database. And this is meant for planners, but you can search them by ordinance type, plan type, chicken ordinance, accessory, hoop, whatever, compost, whatever you're interested in. With that, I think that's the last slide. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Della. I'm a second-year master's in urban and regional planning student. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on how community gardens were used. You said...
Discipline, black and brown bodies.
Yeah, if you could elaborate. Thank you so much.
So there's a history much better than I could explain. I think you should read Laura Lawson's book on history of community gardening in the United States. But I can give little examples from Buffalo. So often I hear people talking about how immigrants don't work hard. And this is not new. There was discussion about this about Irish immigrants when the Irish were new. And you can look at historical artifacts that reference this. And so there was a move, and this is in the book, in the introduction. There was a program that was started in Detroit, It was called, named after the mayor, Pingree's Potato Patches. And a bunch of cities around the United States followed that. And they even had that program in the city of Buffalo. They had it in Boston. There's a historian that has a lovely book on it. And many of these examples were built on this idea that poor people don't work hard. And we're actually seeing a reemergence of that narrative and tenor in public discourse right now. So they were given a spot to go and farm for themselves. But of course, and then it would generate this hardworking spirit, et cetera. Of course, people in those positions of power don't realize how much work, invisible work, those families have to do to keep themselves feeding anyway. So that's what I meant. That was the example. Does that help? Yeah. And it has a modern version too. The presumption that working class, black, white, immigrant, pick your racial group, can engage in community gardening, the same way that people with double income, no kids can. It's the same underlying problem. Does that make sense? Great question.
Hi, my name is Suprita. I'm a first-year MRP student here in regional planning. So my question was with regards to Allison's work with the Land is Public Infra project. So she was not able to do the project on land that she initially wanted from the city government. And so she was able to do it with private land later on, right? But I just wanted to know, what were the challenges with land? Because if it's a good cause and you can give metrical or numerical information of who it's going to benefit, and you can turn the social impact into numerical values for governors to understand, then I struggle to see how that's why is there some friction there? If it's for a good cause and it's serving so many people, ideally there should be a lot of support for it. So why is there so much friction is what I don't understand.
It's a great question. And it's a multi-part answer. I'll try to answer all of it. I think that the first part is tied to you have answered it. So you said, if it is good. So the first thing is what city governments define as good, and what the public defines as good, what developers define as good, and then subsequently, what metrics are considered useful or not useful. So I think the first piece is what you said, if it is good. So it's the discussion of what is good. So in your judgment, maybe in my judgment, the idea that people can eat, the idea that there is green infrastructure and ecological services, the idea that there is an opportunity for a local entrepreneur to start a farm and provide health benefits, we haven't even talked about that yet, is good. And technically, if you read the technical definition of what local governments in the United States are supposed to do, general purpose governments, they're supposed to provide for health and well-being of populations. That's literally the definition of what a local government is supposed to do. But in the United States, I would say, dating back, we can talk Reagan era, et cetera, there's been shift in understanding what the function of a local government is. There's a lot of scholarship describing them as neoliberal arrangements, functioning as urban regime. You can look at urban regime theory. So the definition of who the local government serves, I think, has changed in the United States. And it's very different in other parts of the world. In Stuttgart, Germany, you cannot construct houses or buildings without providing for community gardens. Like, that's part of their code. So that's partly. The second piece is I would actually caution against the second part of your question. You said, well, if we have numerical measures, we can show. In fact, I would argue that there aren't numerical measures, that there are some things that planners in particular, with fiscal impact analysis and other methods, have been trapped epistemologically. Our profession is trapped epistemologically. We are caught in just numbers. And then there are community development planners that are always telling stories of how people feel and how they experience. And I think some of it is that we have done this to ourselves with that metric conversation. So that's the other part. In Allison's case, I think what also explains it is that in 2000s, the city government under a different mayor wanted land to be community gardens because they could not maintain it. So they gave it under a lease to the public. By the time Allison started it in 2014, investors had seen Buffalo as the new frontier. So you had property investors, you have hospitals, et cetera. So now land had become a commodity when Allison arrived. And she is functioning or trying to function in a landscape where the city sees it as investment. That is the direct answer. But Allison's probably online and she might have an answer. We'll see. Good question. Does that answer your question though? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Srishti and I'm first year MRP student. My question is coming from the understanding of commons or the shared resources. And I feel that when we are talking about food, we cannot ignore the fact that it can be equally a common resource, as well as you said, you were talking about land and commodity. Like you said that we have to rethink this whole concept of land being a commodity. So do you have any examples where it is seen as a shared resource? You talked about Allison's work right now, but I would like to know a bit more in the perspective of it being a commons or a shared
What
resource.
a great question. There's a chapter for you in the book written by Emmanuel Frimpong Boama. It's literally about the commons. And he is arguing for thinking about polycentricity as a framework. And he's an Ostrom scholar. So he's literally doing what you're asking. So I would just say read his chapter. But I'll give an example. So there's an organization called Neighbor Space in Chicago. And the city government and Neighbor Space and residents and food advocates did what is necessary as a governance arrangement to think of food as commons. They created this organization where people get to vote and decide and agree on how land gets treated as commons. It's a very different model than Buffalo. I mean, Allison is struggling because that framework around commons does not exist in Buffalo. But I would point to Neighbor Space in Chicago as one example of that. But please read Frimpong Boama's work.
Oh, we can, if you look
It's
at
on the hidden slide. All right, I will be less cheeky today. I will go back and bring, oops, maybe
or
I can't.
we
I
can show you on the table of contents of the book. If you open it up.
Number 3, Frimpong Boama, that's his name, but that's not the paper where he talks about the commons. He talks about commons in the book.
Great. We have another question there.
Hi. I actually think my question is really similar to that, but a little bit more. Oh, yeah, sorry, I forgot about that. I'm Sophia Caparuso. I'm studying environment sustainability in undergrad. And yeah, I was wondering if your work involves community land trusts at all, as like a very similar question, but more specifically.
So people in Buffalo are far smarter in thinking about these things than I am, honestly. So I've been observing them, but they are wrestling with this question. So Allison's farm is a farm, right? But on one of the maps, and I can go back and point that out to you. On this map on the left side, you're seeing those little bright green dots. It says GGWNY Community Gardens. That organization was wrestling with the question that was raised and what you're asking. So today I just chose to focus on Allison's work, but Grassroots Gardens of Western New York is the entity that cut a deal with the mayor preceding Byron Brown and agreed to hold a master lease for public land, and then it makes it available to community gardeners throughout the city. And one of the challenges is, 2 challenges. One, that the city comes along and takes the land back, right? Because it's not a land trust. And then the second challenge is, if I just wanted to garden on a piece of publicly controlled land, then I would have to, in this litigious country, I would have to provide insurance. So Grassroots Gardens of Western New York offers an amazing service, which is they hold liability insurance for every community garden in the city of Buffalo, which is unusual and incredible. But they were wrestling with the question that you just asked several years ago, because the city kept making things difficult for them, just like they made things difficult for Allison. And several years ago, they decided to establish a land trust. So we do have a land trust in the city of Buffalo, and there are not a lot of gardens in that, but that's set up by Grassroots Gardens of Western New York. And that has been a strategy, honestly, to protect land. Good question. In some ways, land trusts are a model for the commons.
Hi, good morning, or afternoon now.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Mario. I'm a first-year MRP student here. I'm wondering, from the perspective of environmental justice, if there's been any barriers in terms of pollution affecting this work, especially like water and soil pollution.
Oh, there's some direct messages going on. Maybe I should hide that. Oh, okay. Let me answer this question first. So, City of Buffalo is a post-industrial city, and pollution is a serious challenge, both in soil but also generally. What I found was that, first of all, that pollution exists because poor governance led to contamination, right? We're living with that. But now, under those circumstances, city government uses that contamination as an excuse for not doing some things rather than figuring out how to fix the problem. Fortunately for us, our farmers already follow the public nurturance frame. So for many years, I was trying to work with some partners, working with city government to establish strategies for safe growing, and they did not want to touch it because of litigation concerns. So instead, what did the urban growers do? They set up something called the Greater Buffalo Urban Growers Network, GBUG. GBUG people might be online. GBUG then set up a pledge that all the growers who are growing food in the city of Buffalo voluntarily will assure no contamination. And the way they do it is they don't grow in the soil unless they do repeat testing. So most of the food production in the city of Buffalo is happening in raised beds that are capped underneath or in greenhouses. So that's one way to do it. But also very excitedly, what's very exciting is that my colleague, Dr. Alex Judelson, who works directly with refugee and immigrant populations, has assembled an interdisciplinary team that is looking at remediation of soils using interesting strategies. I think they're working with mushrooms right now. So a lot of work is happening around that. Until that problem can be fully fixed, people are using some protective strategies. And unfortunately, because of language injustice, I would say, immigrant and refugee populations don't know what environment they find themselves in. So they often fish in polluted waters, they'll grow in polluted soils, and grassroots and other partners are trying to spread more awareness. And an organization called Buffalo Niagara River Keepers has done multi-language guides, etc. Maybe someone here can do some environmental fixes. Okay. Well,
may I ask a question? Quick question.
And if you go next, and then we have one online for you as well.
Some years ago, the department did a fall field trip in Detroit, and we visited a very beautiful urban garden that had been set up on city-owned land with the permission of the city. Situation a little bit different there. The one thing they didn't have was water, so they borrowed water from a neighbor. They ran a hose over the quarter and did all that. At the end of the season, to thank the homeowner for that, Malik, the person running
Malik Yakini.
Yes, brought a box of fresh vegetables to the homeowner as thanks. And the homeowner said, "What am I supposed to do with this?" We had a similar situation when we went down to New Orleans talking about the future of the St. Roch market with kids around there. So obviously it's a difficult and somewhat problematic thing to say, well, you should be eating this way and you're not. So how does, and I assume this is something the community partners work with, but how do you get an audience for what comes out of the gardens?
It's a good question. I think that I think I would begin, well, knowing and with deep respect for Malik Yakini's work, I think that the growers in Detroit do an incredible job of public education along with their growing. I'm just going to use Buffalo as an example. I think there is, again, a public narrative about how particular groups of people don't eat well or they don't know. I'm sure there are people. I don't know how to cook as well as my husband. Like, a lot of us don't know. We're not good cooks, or we don't know what to do with rutabaga, as an example. But I think the question really is, who is the one talking? And who is the one presenting to an audience or seeking an audience to teach them about eating well, as an example? In Buffalo, what I've been grateful for is that, and there was no time to discuss that today, there is actually a coalition, several coalitions, they are in Detroit too, there are coalitions that are playing different roles. So Juneteenth Agricultural Pavilion, which is the vision of Jamie Swigert, is a pavilion that is held at the Juneteenth festival every summer. And it was created because Jamie was concerned about the question, one of the questions that you are asking. And what happens at that festival is that people, elders, chefs from the community are doing the cooking. Miss Della will do the cooking. Allison will do demos. So there's a lot of information being shared by community leaders who are trusted in the community about how to cook. I also think that it is necessary, and then maybe my public health colleague here could speak a lot more to this. He should probably answer this question. But I think that not paying attention to history and disconnecting food from culture creates these sorts of situations where people don't know what to do with the food. If you were to give my mom arugula, she would interpret it as a Kashmiri thing and she would do something with it. She would definitely not make a fancy salad with it. So I think that this question about what will people do with the food is best left to people in that community. And I know that Malik Yakini does that. I also think that growers, if they are not from the community, run a risk of making some presumptions about the community. And in that case, I think it's important for growers to know what people want and then grow that if they're growing it for sale. Allison definitely does that. So I think it's meeting people where they are, but also who is doing the meeting, if that makes sense. Do you approve?
Would you like to add anything? Or are you?
You should also tell people who you are.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Raja. That was an excellent talk. So I'm Dr. Roger Figueroa. I'm a faculty in the Division of Nutritional Sciences here at Cornell. Always learning from your work from a distance, but glad that you're now closer. And we need to check in. But yeah, I was, something that was in my mind is sort of the government shutdown. And, you know, a lot of the thoughts that you're sharing with us are about this process that sort of takes time and involves all these actors at all these levels. But we're kind of in an emergency situation with some people struggling with food insecurity now, not being able to afford foods because resources are going to be limited, reduced or cut. So with food insecurity so prevalent in Buffalo based on your research, you know, how in the short term we deal with this? Is public nurturance a way to think of this issue and provide a lens to do something in the short term as well? Thank you.
Great question. So I'm sighing because Emmanuel's paper, I hope you read it. Buffalo is no stranger to crisis. And as an indigenous Kashmiri, I'm no stranger to crisis. I grew up 1 year in school where there was a shoot at sight order for 6 months. I could not leave the house. I was young. But in Buffalo, we had the COVID crisis where people were shut in. Then we had the massacre. We had a blizzard where 40 people died, right? So unfortunately, in places that have been constantly underserved and people that have been constantly marginalized, things like the shutdown has an extraordinary impact. But I purposefully was not going to talk about the shutdown today. But I'm really glad you asked that question. And the answer is that whenever these crises happen, who helps the community? It's Allison. It's Alex Wright. It's Jamie Swigert. It's Diane Pickard, Massachusetts Avenue Project. So in moments of crises, people band together super fast and they start doing what needs to happen. So I'll give an example. Post-massacre, my lab started getting calls and saying, we need to send food. and we need mental health resources. So what did I do? I called Allison. Allison called Alex. So I think within 1 week of the massacre, we had a logistics operation going, where Allison was providing the food, Alex was delivering it. The lab was simply back-end spreadsheet management, and people were filling out a community form. And then we shut it down by July because other resources need to step in. And my observation is that in Buffalo and on the east side, this happens over and over and over and over again. So already, people are starting to extend their pantry hours. People are checking in on their families and friends. That has already started. I mean, I've already sent Allison text to find out if she has capacity to deliver, and she says yes. So all of that is happening. I think the reason public nurturance is important in the long run is that if we invest in that infrastructure, then acute moments like this will have less of an impact. My concern about acute moments in Buffalo and across the country is that when there are solutions to those acute moments, that they are extractive, meaning a lot of money will go to particular organizations, and it will actually not reach those families. Buffalo has an incredible history of mutual aid, where people ask for things, other people drop it off. And my hunch is it's that mutual aid response that is going to serve everybody. But to be honest, and talking to planners here, why is this country a place where my tax dollars are used to bomb people and people have to rely on mutual aid? Doesn't make sense. So to answer your question, I think people are already ramping up. But honestly, in Buffalo, people are also burnt out. People are burnt out from responding to so many crises. But that's what's going to help. I did read that state of Ohio just announced extra aid for stopgap measure. So I'm hoping that our mayors and our state government will do something. We had a mayoral food forum just 2 days ago. And this was a question that was going to be asked. Well, the leading candidate never showed up. I hope he hears this.
There is a question online. There we go. Oh, there's a few questions.
Okay.
The first
So
one is...
should I start from the top?
Oh, yeah. The first one is a little bit about sharing a little bit more of that poem and the power of that Kashmiri thinking.
Okay. So that is a former student of mine, again, holding my feet to the fire. Murray, thank you. It's Kashmiri, not Kashmirian. But just a little stanza from that. One of the stanzas from Sheikh Alam's poem is Yel poshe van, til poshe an. And it means until forests exist, we will exist. Not we will exist, but our food will exist. And I wish I was a better translator, Murray, but it is the indigenous way of thinking about our relationship with land, not as having dominion over it, but as being of the land, that I draw from Sheikh Alam. I hope that answers your question. Okay, and then Insha Akram, who's a PhD student at University of Washington, former Food Lab member, now alum, also holding my feet to fire. Okay. She argues that the examples I mentioned show that planning is political, yet we teach it as a technical exercise in planning schools. As someone who wants to have a hope for the future, what are your thoughts on how we teach planning in schools and how we approach planning in our research, considering that planning is anything but technical? I agree with Insha. I think we should trash our planning technical curriculum, or at least revisit it, and at a minimum recognize that it is anything but technical. That doesn't mean that we don't learn technical skills. I'll be the first one to say you all need to understand spatial analysis in order to argue for equity. It cannot be one or the other. It needs to be all epistemological methods. I mean, maybe this is a call to the faculty here and to Cornell. Maybe I hope you all are teaching planning as both technical and political. Insha, I think that means you have to get your PhD and be a faculty member. That's my answer.
Great
Okay.
answer.
Then, Marcia gave a great example. I'm so sorry, Marcia. Marcia is also the co-editor of the book, which I completely skipped. And she is responding, I think, to 2 questions about the commons and a land trust. Thank you, Marcia. It is a 31-acre site, and Marcia has a chapter in the book on this. So please look it up. It's an incredible example, and she has, I think, done a very candid analysis of it. She was involved in setting it up. Marcia was my dissertation committee member. Some of you all might know her, but also the executive director of an organization that maintained and grew this project called Rooted in Madison that balances urban agriculture and housing, affordable housing. Thank you, Marcia. Always saving me.
Okay, I have a question and Della has a question. I'm going to hand it to you. Okay, can I ask a question, maybe 2 parts to it? So your point 5 about governance regimes and its politics, listening to you, the power of organizing in Buffalo just jumps out. You said it yourself, but you demonstrated it across time and with so much depth. And in your answers, you've given us layers more of this terrain of organizing. And you made a really, I thought, such an important comment that it's not civil society's job to decode planning. Yet I'm interested in how you think about the governance terrain in Buffalo that is constituted by those civil society structures, by the power of that organizing. So is that a move to some of this reshift in governance? I mean, how do you, sorry, that's very long-winded, but.
No, it's great. And I really appreciate it because I'm hoping to think through this more clearly. I think that Buffalo, I would say, is extremely rich in we actually have a phrase, I forget what we say, but Emmanuel, myself, Eli Mui, who is now at Hopkins, I'm forgetting somebody, some other partners, but we've been studying, Gabby Hedrick, who's at George Washington. We've been documenting the role of social infrastructures and networks in helping food systems transformation under the conditions of a neoliberal government regime, right? And within that context, I think community organizing is the driving force with some challenges. So there is Juneteenth Agricultural Pavilion, which is literally a community organizing effort. Episodic, because people gather once a year and then they continue, and Jamie wants to grow it. There's also something called the Buffalo Food Equity Network, which I didn't mention. It was on one of the slides. Buffalo Food Equity Network is a caucus space for Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks working on food justice. They're always sharing resources, information, etc. And then we have this incredible organization, which actually has ties to Cornell, called Partnership for Public Good. Partnership for Public Good does trainings for people around Policy 101. And our lab does trainings around Food Policy 101. And then there are other community organizing efforts. And I think it's because of those community organizing efforts that there has been some infiltration of food into public policy. And I described that as Rust Belt radicalism in a prior paper. The problem, though, is, and I don't know how to sort this, and maybe you can help me. The problem is illustrated in Emmanuel's paper, where we notice that in these social networks, there are these actors and organizations that carry the burden. They are uneven. Some have more resources, some have less resources. And so the very entities that deserve support are the ones that are doing the legwork of community organizing. And in Buffalo, it's many, many, many Black women and elders. So Miss Della, who founded the food co-op in 1978, was guiding the mayoral food forum 2 days ago. It's exhausting. Community organizing is exhausting. So I think that one of the roles that they can do, that civil society and community organizing piece, is to mediate that decoding. That's it. But what happens in acute crisis is they're called upon to do everything. And that's the part that concerns me, is we've created this binary, not-for-profit good, government bad, that allows us to let the government off the hook. I think a more tactical strategy would be figure out what people want, decode policy, and close that gap. Maybe I'll change that number 5. I'll call Sophie's number 5.
Then we definitely
I don't know
have
if I
Della.
answered your question. I was just thinking aloud.
Hi again.
Hi.
I have a bit of a follow-up question from Insha, and also a little bit of context. I'm working on a project with the American Planning Association's Women in Planning and LGBTQ+ divisions on how we can, as planners, use the tools of planning, which are meant for exclusion, for more inclusionary purposes. And I was wondering how you, particularly in your classes, in your curriculum, besides the content of your lab, for example, teach planners how to use our tools for good, for not so evil.
I'm careful in answering that because the tools of the oppressor are rarely, if ever, the tools for the liberated. I'm rephrasing a very, very wise author that some of you might know. Does anybody know who I'm drawing from?
Got an answer here. That's what I was going to say.
Yes. So I wrestle with that. That's like a daily struggle. Every morning I wake up and I say, what am I doing today? But I think that the tools that planners have, at a minimum, I teach my students to understand them and their limits. If you don't understand fiscal impact analysis, then your critique of fiscal impact analysis isn't really grounded in any real understanding of that method. So I encourage people to understand them. I think very early in my career, I would say, how can we use fiscal impact analysis for good? I'm less prone to do that now. I say, well, we need a food impact analysis, and cause some controversy. But at a minimum, I'm okay with using some of the tools as long as the framework that's guiding the tools is not of the oppressor. You know? But one thing that I do find helpful over the years is turning more and more to, this will sound strange, but art and fiction, and spending a lot of time with people who help expand imagination. And funny, we train planners to think about the future, but I have noticed that lately in a lot of technical exercises, we don't teach judgment. We teach decision-making using a set of rubric, but not judgment. And that good judgment needs to also have creative judgment and imagination. So since I don't have even a cell of creativity in my own body, I partner with poets and artists and other people. And there's a lot to be learned from fiction that I wonder why planners don't do more of it. I don't have an answer for what prescription, other than to say, make sure you're reading the right fiction before you apply that tool. So to make sense of what was happening right now in the country, I reread Olivia. Octavia. My student's name is Olivia. I'm thinking about Olivia. May she also write like Octavia Butler. But I reread Parable of the Sower, and I was like, this all makes sense. And she was not a planner. So read Parable of the Sower. I know it sounds depressing, but it'll feel good right now. Also,
Yes.
Jerry did the first study of gender parity in APA salaries. Did you know that?
I was wondering why his name sounded so familiar.
That's why. Good job.
Can I ask another question?
Sure. It's your time. All of your time.
I was going to say that at some level, part of one of the potential benefits of the kind of activities that you've described in the organizations you describe is the way that they teach engagement or they're doing planning. But then I'm thinking, well, it's also probably true that government sort of says, okay, knock yourself out. And you have the exhaustion with the groups as you describe it. But you also talked about the need for the food impact analysis. So I was going to sort of circle back and say all of the efforts that are being done, I'm sure are not what's needed, but how are you measuring or knowing the actual goal of feeding people and bringing the food with all of the efforts that are going on?
Good question. So, and this is directly tied to my lab, right? Is that the question about research or generally in planning?
Or generally in Buffalo.
Oh, in Buffalo. We have projects that are at different scales. So I'll give an example of how we are doing it, but I'm afraid to say that in Buffalo, food insecurity is not diminishing. I'm just going to say it. And part of that is that one of the biggest public protection systems for against food insecurity is Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP. And as you all know, SNAP is being dismantled, right? So food insecurity I cannot say that it's getting better. So there's the acute response and there is the long-term response. And I would say that some of what our partners are doing, some are doing acute response, some are doing long-term response. And measuring change for both is different. So for the acute response, I would say that when crises happen, the community organizations and the networks, they are able to do a smaller scale of food provisioning, but it has very high accuracy. So to use the post-massacre time as an example, one of the organizations called Black Lives Resist the Rust, which no longer exists, set up a community intake form where people filled out what they needed, and Allison, Alex, and others delivered to those addresses. And the reason people use that community form is because of high trust between Blur, Allison, Alex, all of these Black-led organizations. So I would say the scale might not have been large, but it was highly accurate. Contrast that with post-COVID, Buffalo School District had a lot of food that they got through all the supply chain that was established as COVID response. But a good chunk of that did not reach the populations because they didn't actually know. I'm not going to name names, but one of the staff there called us, our lab, and asked, how do we provide this? We don't know where to send it. So there are two things happening. There's very high-level, high-scale food emergency distribution, and there is high-impact food emergency distribution. And I would say that these coalitions are high-impact, high-accuracy food distribution in acute times. And this is throw everything at the wall, it may not stick kind of response. I have not measured this. I have measured this. So the scale is small, but accurate. The other metric that we do use is that my lab has tracked MAP's youth for now almost 20 years. Different cohort comes in, we do focus groups and surveys with them over time. And what's interesting is that their understanding of food system changes, statistically demonstrated. Their understanding of themselves changes. Their understanding of where to get food from changes, their cooking skill change, etc. But their diet does not. And the reason the diet does not change is because the surrounding wealth gap, like their families cannot actually procure it, there's a limitation to that. And for that reason, I think planning and public health have to work together on income and wealth generation as a strategy, not just let's put a grocery store in a neighborhood. I'm an advocate of putting grocery stores where they need to be, but it is an impartial solution to a structural problem. Does that help?
Yeah. I'm going to just conclude with a huge thank you. What an inspiring talk that is practical, political, poetic, and actually really about the epistemologies and the practice of what we do. And I'm sure each of us is taking something really, powerful away to think through. And I also think it's fantastic that you are around the corner.
I am, and I do have a message from Molly Reardon, who's an alum from your MRP program. And she said that you all were supposed to be like roused and radicalized by my talk. It's her, it's not me saying, talk to Molly.
So you don't have to be roused in this second or radicalized, but we're going to think and stew on what you've offered us.
Can I do a little networking? Molly Reardon is the president of American Planning Association Food Division. So one of your alums. So please connect with her if you're thinking about planning practice. The food division would love to see more Cornell people. I'm sure she would. She's now at UB doing PhD with the food lab, but please connect with her.
Wonderful. And thank you for everybody who came on Zoom as well. So for those of you here in the room, we have the pleasure of the chance to have a small chat, more intimate chat with Samina. So that will start in room 105. And I'm sure, you have a little bit of time to get here because there'll be a chat after as well. So see you there. And thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
My pleasure.